So Jane, welcome back to Write with Impact.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, now we spoke on a previous episode of Write with Impact, and you shared some writing tips. So I just thought I'd just call you up again and see if you'd be interested in talking about a topic that is sort of burning up the internet, LinkedIn, and everywhere else. And it's a topic that you actually have been writing about in the Boston Globe, and you were interviewed on CBS Sunday Morning recently on nationwide TV about ChatGPT.
Yes, it is the biggest change to how we think about teaching writing and writing that I think we've ever had.
You're the director of the Harvard Writing Center, and you work with undergraduate students and I believe also graduate students to help them improve their writing. As an educator, as a teacher of writing, what are you seeing, and what do you make of all this? Let's just sort of ease our way into this very, very big topic that I'm still trying to grapple with. I think a lot of people are, but you've been articulating some very interesting viewpoints about this, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. Yes. So a little bit of background. I was a little bit early to the table to be thinking and talking about ChatGPT, thanks to one of my undergraduate writing tutors who is a computer science major at Harvard and had come into my office in the fall of 2021 and said, Jane, you have to see this. You have to see what's coming. And at that time, OpenAI had something called the ChatGPT playground. It was just the GPT playground, I believe. It was before the chatbot was introduced. So it was a little bit harder to figure out how to work with it. You couldn't prompt it as easily, but you could, if you figured out what to ask it, you could say, write me a college paper that's 1,000 words on the following topic. It didn't have access to, it wasn't as well trained as it is now. But so I had been working with this and thinking, oh, wow, something's coming, but I didn't know when it was coming. And then all of a sudden they released the ChatGPT and everyone was talking about it. So that allowed me, I think, to have sort of work through some of my thoughts and concerns about it before everyone started talking about it. But I think now everybody is talking about nothing but ChatGPT, as I have a Google News alert on my setup on Google. So every morning I get an email with all the articles about ChatGPT, and it's longer and longer every day. But I think I've gotten away from the question that you were asking me, which was what am I thinking about this? What am I concerned about? Was that where we were starting?
I think so. Yeah, let's start somewhere.
So, I mean, I think that a useful way that I've found to explain my concern about this and to think about my concern is the difference between process and product, right? So ChatGPT creates a written product. You say to it, write me a college paper, write me some real estate listings, write me an investment report, whatever it is that you're doing in your field, and out it comes, right? It's a complete product. So that's one way of thinking about it. This machine can do our writing for us. But when you teach writing, you're not really in search of a product, you're in search of a thought process, right? For my students, I'm much less interested in what the product is. We can get a product from anywhere. What I'm interested in is, what are they interested in? What kinds of questions do they have? And how does the process of writing in answer to a question help you figure out what you think? And that's not what ChatGPT is designed to do, right? It's a product. So I think that for educators, the concern, and it's a very reasonable and real concern, is if what we're really trying to do is teach critical thinking and help our students become people who understand the world, know what they think, know what they want to ask questions about, it's hard to imagine that this chatbot is the way to achieve that goal. And yet it's there and it's easily accessible and people are using it. So now we have to figure out how we coexist with this technology.
Right. I've seen you do a couple of experiments with it. You write, you have a Substack called Writing Hacks, which I love. And you've been writing a little bit there about your experimentation with ChatGPT. I've been experimenting a bit with it and having some fun. For example, I asked ChatGPT, I gave a prompt to write a blog post on how to write with more impact, but in the style of William Shakespeare. And it was hilarious, of course, totally, utterly useless. But so you're talking about, as an educator, you're focused on, teaching, working through the process, teaching the process of writing as a way to teach how to think, right? How to articulate your thoughts on paper or on the computer.
If you think about it this way, so for example, a piece of writing advice that I always give that people seem to find very helpful is that when you are writing a draft of something, you always figure out what you think along the way. So it's helpful to look in that last paragraph in the conclusion, right? To say, all right, maybe this is actually my main point. I've written myself to my main idea. So that's a process. And that happens to my students a lot. They'll find the thing that they want to be their thesis in the conclusion of that first draft. But it also happens to all of us when we write at work, right? You may sit down to think through a memo or to think through some plan. And as you're writing, you realize, oh no, actually, this is what I want to say, or this is what we need to focus on. So what happens when instead of going through that process, you prompt the chatbot, you say, write me a memo about X, or write me a paper about X. Now, perhaps in the optimistic framing of this, out comes this output and you realize it's not what you think, and you go back and you work through that same process that you would have gone through without prompting the chatbot first, and you still figure out this thing that you think that matters to you. But do you, or do you take this output, this product that looks okay in certain ways, and just that becomes your idea, that becomes what you go with? And what are we losing in that process? In my experiments with the chatbot, it can write me a paper about a variety of things. Right now, it's not the greatest paper, right? But it looks like a paper. Am I going to hand that in, or am I going to do something with that, revise that in some way, instead of ever figuring out what my idea would have been if I had started without the chatbot? And I guess I think, I'm idealistic as a writing teacher. There's no point in doing any of this if you're not figuring out what you actually think. I tell this to my students all the time. Like, this is not a little hoop to jump through to show me that you can put words on a page. I know you can put words on a page. We are doing this because I think, and I hope you think, it's important that you figure out what you believe, what matters to you in the world about this idea, what side of this issue makes sense to you. When you go through the process of analyzing evidence, you're actually figuring out whether that evidence makes sense to you, what that evidence points towards. What happens when you just put a passage into the chatbot and say, analyze this evidence for me? What happens to what you actually think?
Right. It's if I think back to my college days and grad school days, when I would wait until the last minute to sit in the library and do the research and write my paper and stay up all night. It was hard. I did it. I somehow survived that. But I can imagine today, students may not have to stress too much about that, and maybe be able to turn in, something that's passable, maybe even gets an A, and gets them, through their class, and lets them pass or even do very well. Just thinking of very, very practical, implications of this in an educational setting. And I want to be optimistic, but I'm not entirely optimistic. I think, just to be totally honest, I think students will, when given this, this free, powerful tool, they may start charging. I believe there's a subscription model being introduced very soon. Regardless, they'll get access to it one way or another. If they have to pay for it, they'll pay for it. It's going to have an impact, I believe, on education, on students' willingness to put in the work, to put in the time, to think. and to learn how to write. So, what's the value of trying to continue to teach, how to write? I'm sure, schools, educational institutions are not going to, stop anytime soon, but they are going to be faced with this powerful tool that is only getting more powerful, by the way. Supposedly the next iteration is
Yep.
going to be launched later this year. And of course, there are a whole range of competitors that are about to launch their application, their chatbot. I won't go through all of that. I'm just trying to think through the implications. Let's just talk about education right now. And in a minute or two, we can talk about the implication for writing, editing, content creation industry. But before we get there, let's just focus a little bit more on
Yeah.
education.
I think that it's not really even just about writing. It's about the whole system of education, right? This chat GPT can code. You could say, oh, well, we could stop teaching writing and we could do what, public speaking, or we could do different sorts of projects. If people want to, they're going to be able to use chat GPT to help them with all of those things. So at some point, I think the question just really has to be, what do we want our students to get out of education? How are we going to get them there, with or without this technology? And how are we going to make the case that these things matter? I am not, I have no background in elementary or secondary education, so I can't really speak to how this will play out there. At the college level, I think we're going to have to make the case that these skills matter. Whether it's writing or thinking, there's going to be a choice that you're going to have to make. Do I want to use the chat bot or do I want to figure out whether I can do this without the chat bot? I don't know. As you say, I don't know what this is going to look like when the chat bot gets better. So right now, I mean, the chatbot hallucinates, right? It will give you quotations from books that don't exist in those books. And it's not the greatest writer in many ways. And so what we're seeing now, right, when I experiment with it, is that you're going to do much better if you actually have the skills yourself that you developed pre-chatbot, and you can take the output that you get and understand its limitations. I don't know what that's going to look like when the chatbot, what seems the threat or the promise that I keep hearing about how the next version is going to be so much more powerful. I don't think we know what that's going to look like. But at some point, right, like I'm hearing a lot of people sort of when I read education blogs and education journals talking about, well, we're going to need to use this to teach, we're going to have to teach with it because it's here. My concern there, I understand that, right? I don't think it's going to make sense to ban it because it's not going to be possible. But my concern about what I'm hearing right now, at least about teaching with it, is that most of it seems to be ideas that people are coming up with because they have to, right? Because it exists, not necessarily because those ideas are pedagogically better than what we used to do. I mean, there's always room for improvement in the way we teach. The question is, does that improvement come from using ChatGPT, or are we hearing about everyone's experiments with ChatGPT because they feel they have no choice but to use this in the classroom, because if they don't use it, their students are going to be using it anyway. At the same time, I'm hearing a lot of institutions with honor codes and whole public school systems are saying you may not use this. And it will be interesting to see what happens there, because it seems like it's going to be very hard to enforce such a policy.
Right. One potential solution I've read about is just doing more sort of live writing, in class writing tests. I mean, I remember I took when I would take my history exams, I would get a blue book, or I think that's what it was called. It was,
Right.
get a
Yes.
little, and I'd open it up, and man, I'd just write as fast as I possibly could, and my hand almost fell
Yeah.
off. I had no help, from that. I mean, so that seems like a pretty simple low tech solution. What do you think?
So I mean, I understand why that may happen and why it might make sense in certain contexts. That type of writing is different, right? So when you were doing that, that was an exam. You were going to be evaluated on your knowledge. So you open the blue book and you put your knowledge into the blue book. So in that context, that was probably a useful measure for the professor in that course. What we lose there is the kind of writing that I teach, right, where people work through multiple drafts of something, starting with a question that they don't think has been answered in a way that makes sense to them, and they want to join that conversation, and they're going to write a paper that is the product of a lot of thought. You can't do that in a blue book in 45 minutes, right? So
Mhm.
I think that those are two separate tasks. And again, we're always back, for me, to the difference between the process and the product. We can find a way in a classroom to have students generate a product without the help of technology. It's going to be more challenging, not impossible. I'm sure we're going to do it, but it's going to be more challenging to find new ways to help people work through a thought process if it doesn't seem like we can have them do it in the old-fashioned way that we've been doing. Now, I should say, a lot of people, and you're probably one of them, will say to me in these contexts, well, I remember writing a lot of papers in college where I don't think I felt like I was learning some fabulous new thing, and I felt like I was just jumping through a hoop and creating a product. I understand that, but I think we have to be thinking about what we're aspiring to in education, right? Like those assignments where we all stayed up all night and wrote it the night before it was due. I knew a guy who wrote his whole senior thesis of 60 pages in 2 days before it was due. That was obviously, he did not have the experience with his senior thesis that I had with mine, but the system was set up so that I could have the experience I had with mine, right? I learned so much from that process of writing that, and I went off to graduate school in history because of that. Where will those opportunities be if we take writing, that kind of writing, out of the equation? And I don't think anyone is planning right now to take that kind of writing out of the equation, but if we got to a point where it seemed like that was the choice, I think something important would be lost.
Right. I mean, also, we can't just think of sort of you know, it's one student, one type of student. There are students of various, varying levels of skill levels, back experience, interests, motivation levels, all of that. I'm not an educator, so I'm not an expert in this. But what I would say, I've seen it as a prior student in the past, and I see it through my children. Maybe there will be sort of like how they have different levels for English or even science or math. Maybe there will be tracks, and maybe it's already built into the system to some extent, but maybe it'll be a little bit more explicit where there will be a track where, let's say, you're expected to sort of write by yourself. You're supposed to generate content yourself and go through that traditional process, and you've signed maybe an honor code, and you genuinely want to do that, and you're going to be judged to higher standards of quality. And then there will be other classes, maybe other tracks, that will sort of expect less, but will sort of try to get you to understand how to evaluate certain types of text that, say, the ChatGPT or other generative AI applications generate, but you become more of a sort of evaluator of that content. I'm just making this up because I don't know where this will lead. I'm not an educator,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking it can't just be a one size fits all solution. That just seems like common sense to me. But right now, I think we're all kind of thinking that this is going to make teachers lives very difficult. It's going to ruin the education opportunity, ruin how students learn to write, and therefore to some extent think and discover their own ideas and create their own ideas. That's sort of the doomsday scenario, which I hear playing out. On the other hand, I hear others, like there's a professor, I believe, at Wharton, at the business school of Wharton, who is actually quite proactively, enthusiastically trying to incorporate ChatGPT into his class setting, and he's writing about it, he's documenting it, and he's trying to do it, I think, in a very thoughtful, constructive way. That's at I believe at the graduate level. I don't know if he teaches undergraduate. So we got K through 12 to college, all the way through graduate school to think about it. So all very, very different levels, different learning objectives, different students, different backgrounds. It's a very big, complicated question that it's just going to be, I'm just watching the space like you are. I haven't set up a Google alert yet, but I probably shouldn't, because I'm already overwhelmed by, people like yourself, pontificating on, no. So I'm watching it very, very carefully, especially, with the announcements that it will get stronger. I think GPT-4 is, if that's what it's called, it's going to have, trillions of, what the heck they call them, variables or whatever. So it's a big topic. So maybe we should, if there's anything else you want to, any other views you have on this, let me know. And then we can move on to, the workplace, which I think is very interesting, and writing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly happy to switch gears and talk about the workplace. I mean, I think the last thing I would say about the education piece is that a lot of people are expressing very clear and definitive ideas about what this is going to mean. And the fact is, I don't think anyone really knows.
Right.
And I think, it makes sense that people are experimenting. It also makes sense that people are very concerned about it. I think jumping in, the internet, social media create such a pressure to have a hot take. I'll tell you the truth, people say, about what's really going to happen. Nobody knows. And I think it makes sense for educators and for everyone to be paying close attention, but not making a giant pronouncement yet about what it all means.
That's right. So let's move on to, I call it the workplace, and that could include, working, in a corporate or company setting. It could be a, startup to a large company, or it could be, working as a solopreneur or freelancer, as a, writer or editor or both, a content creator. What do you think is going to be the impact? It's available. You can start using it now. How do you think people are using it? What are you hearing or seeing people use? How are they using it now? And then how do you think this will impact how people, work, get their work done? And then ultimately, will this have an impact on their productivity? And then another question could be around, how will it impact jobs?
Yeah, I mean, beyond my area of expertise, but I understand why that would be a concern. So what I'm hearing, and this is all anecdotally, although people, because I write this newsletter about writing at work, people tend to tell me things about this, what they're concerned about, by email, or when I run into my neighbors. People are using it to write emails. I read a fascinating article about how people in the real estate profession are using it to write property listings. There was somebody interviewed in the article who talked about how many hours it took them to do this kind of thing before, and how this is a complete game changer, they said. I think right now, I've heard of people, someone just told me that they used it to a high school teacher told me that she used it to write a letter of recommendation, but it wasn't good. And she ended up throwing it out and writing her own. So I think at this point, people are trying to see what they can get it to do. But remember, we are all of a generation that learned how to do the things we need to do in our fields before ChatGPT came along, so we can assess it. Those people in those professions can say, is this doing a better job than I could do? And they will know the answer. This feels to me very different than if you look ahead 10, 20 years and you have a generation of people who've always used ChatGPT, and then we just have a bunch of machines talking to each other, which seems like a depressing dystopia, right? I send you an email using chat, you write back using chat. Why are we bothering on some level? So I guess what I'm getting at there is that I'm hearing about a lot of potential uses for this in the workplace. There's this tape running in the back of my mind thinking, does human connection matter? And my answer is yes. And what is this going to do, not just in education, but in the workplace, to those moments where you feel like there's a human being on the other end of something, and that's part of what makes what you do meaningful. And then you know that there's not a human being there, that the real estate description was generated by a machine, that the email was generated by a machine. Is this going to have some kind of impact on our quality of life? Now, of course, the impact on your quality of life, if the machine is doing the work for you, is that you have more free time. So I guess that's also an impact on your quality of life.
Right. No, I think, yeah, I think there's going to be two sides to it. I think definitely, I can see I ran a poll, one of those quick surveys on LinkedIn, and asked, the question, what will be the biggest impact on writers and other content creators of ChatGPT? And the biggest impact is, number one is it will accelerate the creation of content, and number two, it will improve productivity. And then I realized those are probably pretty much the same answers. But I think, and then create new ideas is much smaller. It's less than 13-14% of respondents said help generate more creative ideas, and then another small percentage said will help cut content creation costs. I think my take on this is that it's going to be all of the above, and it'll be a different mixture, different weighting for of these factors, of these benefits, depending on on a number of things. So I think I see, it's interesting though that people came out very quickly that it will help them improve the productivity. That's a good thing. And then will that free them up to free us up as writers and editors to spend more time on thinking, on talking to people, on researching, on writing, and improving therefore the content that we write? Maybe. So I think I'm quite optimistic in that respect. Will it lead to better thinking, better writing? Maybe. And then what will be the role of the human being? I think we will have a role going forward for a while. I don't think we're going to be made obsolete very quickly, but I think maybe some roles, some functions in writing, editing, content creation, and I'll limit it to that for now, because we can go very, very broad on the impact of the different roles, different jobs. I think it will it could potentially reduce the need for some roles, and therefore free up that need. And this is always, to me, balanced against what I see as sort of an increasing need for people who can create valuable, compelling, shareable content. And so but then companies have a concern about their profits, about their costs. There's always that pressure in whether it be in the large corporate world or in startups, or even as a freelancer or solopreneur, you're always looking at costs. It will have I believe it will have an impact. I think it could lead to a reduced demand for certain roles. What do you think?
I mean, again, the economy at large is outside of my area of expertise. I think that the idea that more and more of what humans do at work will be outsourced to machines is alarming for a number of reasons. And I guess I want us to be asking the question, just because a machine can do something, does that mean a machine should do the thing? Again, sort of like, Glenn, I like to read your posts on LinkedIn. If you told me your posts were entirely generated by ChatGPT, I don't think I would want to read them anymore, right? That's not interesting to me. So we could ask, why is that? Well, it's because I want to know what Glenn is thinking about right now. And if Glenn types into the machine, which we know a lot of content is already generated this way, right? Not yours, but if Glenn types into the machine, write a post about, how content creators are losing work because of ChatGPT, I can do that myself, right? I don't need to read you doing that. So I think we're going to need to find the place where the human connection matters. And the idea, and partly, as a writer and a writing teacher, I've always kind of resisted the terminology of content creation as opposed to writing, because it sounds sort of like, who wants to read content and who wants to engage with content? I want to engage with ideas, and ideas come from a human. And I feel like this may be just another step towards this idea that the product, it doesn't matter who created the product is just there. But then it always has mattered, right? So if you ask people, do you want to read a novel that's been entirely generated by AI? Some people might say, sure, that's entertaining. Other people will say no, because this author that worked hard to create this world, that's part of my experience of reading this, is that it came from another human being's mind. And it's possible that we will adjust to a world in which that human being first generates a draft with AI and then edits it. Right now, that seems depressing to me. I may be, I think about this for a living, so I may be an outlier in finding that depressing, but I think we should all stop and think about whether that's the world we actually want to live in. Now, does that translate to if someone writes a real estate listing, or am I as upset if I find out that the way this house I might want to buy has been described was written by ChatGPT? Probably not. So we
Right.
have to figure out where that line is.
Exactly. I've been asked to deliver a very short speech this week, and if I think about it, ChatGPT cannot do it for me. So that's kind of reassuring. And I'm not going to go through all
So
the deep.
why can't it? I mean, what are its
Exactly.
limitations there?
All right. Good question. Let me try to answer that.
Yeah. I'll have you on my podcast if I ever have one.
just write about me on writing hacks over at Substack, Jane Rosenzweig. Because I'm going to be telling a lot about the history of our office, and only I know that history because I've been there so long. So that history has not been documented publicly because there's been no need to, and we wouldn't want to anyway. So it's not documented, it's not out there, and therefore the bots, the scanners, the machines that are vacuuming all of this content, all this text out there, have no access to that. They would have to insert a chip into my head, and maybe that's where we're headed at some point. So I don't want to go down that route, but they would have to insert a chip into my head and suck up my memories. And again, maybe that'll be possible in the future, but not right now. ChatGPT is not capable of doing that. So only I could do that. And I've been invited to share some of those, memories and experiences that only I have, and maybe a handful of others have. And I happen to be around and available to talk about it. So I think that's interesting. If you think about it that way, feel slightly encouraged. I'm sort of, trying to make myself feel, like I'm worthwhile and valuable, for at least for the next few years. And I think it's clear it's going to be applicable across so many domains. Another example I would give is Joanna Penn, who is an author. She writes novels, and she also writes books, nonfiction books, about the writing craft. And I interviewed her on this podcast several years ago. She just published a book, a memoir about her walking different trails around in the UK and elsewhere. She had some sort of personal crisis, and she decided to just start walking these trails. And so she wrote about it. So if I were to put a prompt into, enter a prompt into ChatGPT, write a memoir about, walking these different trails, I'm sure ChatGPT will come up with an answer, but I know from my recent experience experimenting with ChatGPT, it will not come up with, Joanna Penn's experience,
Right.
Of walking these trails. So she's a wonderful writer, wonderful person, and I do look forward to reading that. She's launching it on Kickstarter. Again, I sound like
Cool.
I'm promoting her book for her, but I'm happy to do so because I'm trying to make the point, obviously, that there's certain things that ChatGPT can't do yet. Yay, so I on the other hand, I when I hear myself talk like this, I do feel like it's, I sound like I'm trying to justify, my livelihood, and that of other writers and editors like us.
Well, I think for someone who's writing a memoir, or for when I'm writing an opinion piece for the Boston Globe or whatever, we're doing it with the knowledge, because we've been writers for a long time, that we actually get something out of the writing process. There's a lot of satisfaction in figuring out what you think, getting the words on the page in the way that you want, creating something beautiful. Those are the people I worry about the least, in a sense. We're going to
Mm.
keep doing it. All of the fiction writers I know who've written these beautiful books, that they didn't just do that to get a product out there. They did that to have the experience of doing it. They get something out of that. They order the world in some way that works for them. They find meaning in doing that. What I worry more about are people who may actually get a lot out of writing in terms of just figuring out what they think about a particular issue, students in that context, or people who are solving problems at work and actually figure things out because they have developed over time the critical thinking skills to develop and solve those problems. I worry about what this technology is going to mean in its various uses for that, right? For people who don't think of themselves as writers, who may now be using ChatGPT starting in second grade. Are they going to be people who can solve problems, who can think critically? And people say, well, people worried about the same thing when we had a calculator introduced into math. It doesn't strike me as exactly the same thing. This strikes me as incredibly all-pervasive, potentially, where, everyone's just going to turn to ChatGPT for everything. And that I worry about more. It has, to me, I don't think the introduction of a calculator sort of created this pending sense of a dystopian future that I think ChatGPT at its worst, and we don't know if that will happen, right? But there's a kind of outlier potential for this, where people are really just outsourcing all of their thinking to this machine because they can. I don't know. Have you seen this movie? I wouldn't recommend it as a movie, but it's called Idiocracy.
No.
It's about a guy who accidentally falls asleep for something, like they put him to sleep for some experiment, but they leave him asleep for 500 years. And when he wakes up, he's the smartest person in the world, because everyone has just progressively
Mhm.
stopped thinking for various reasons. I keep having flashes of this not very good movie when I think about this. Like, what will the world look like if this goes the direction where we're just sort of outsourcing our thinking? Now, there are many optimistic people who think that this is going to be wonderful for our thinking. It's going to let us go further by leaps and bounds to all sorts of interesting possibilities. I hope so, but I haven't seen the evidence of that yet. So I remain concerned.
Exactly. I would have to just pick up on that. I would say I'm highly skeptical of that outcome. And the reason why I say that is, not that I'm able to tell what's going to happen in the future, because I feel like things are still very uncertain, especially with this new technology. But just looking back at, say, Google, the internet, all these technologies that are incredibly powerful, that have, to some extent, improved productivity, changed how we, do things, whether in education or at work, made us more productive. And yet we still feel so busy and tired and stressed out, and we've got all kinds of health problems. And I say we, just in general, and we have so many problems in the world. We haven't solved so many problems that are out there, whether it be disease or poverty or war. Weren't these supposed to be solved to some extent, by these technologies? What's so I don't think, I'm not saying that, those who are producing these technologies or advocating for them are promising anything around the how chat GPT or other generative AI applications will impact or solve in any way these problems. So I think we have to manage our expectations, but also just manage our our fears and not get overly paranoid about it. But when you do play around with it, it is eerie, it's creepy, right? I was starting to write about it on Substack, and I was just trying to think, what am I going to say that hasn't already been said in the past 3 weeks,
Yes,
by the
there have been
likes
a
of
lot of takes.
exactly by the likes of Jane Rosenzweig at the Harvard Writing Center. She's covered it all pretty much, and that professor at Wharton who's writing about it every week. It's hard to say something new about it already. It's hard to make predictions, right? Some, if I want to sound reasonably intelligent, it is difficult. So I've been reluctant to hit publish on that article. But I have played around with it, and it is impressive. It's creepy, and yet it's also not usable. A lot of the,
In many contexts,
right,
yes.
the content that it produces, it's I'm like, wait a minute, I need to edit this, but having an assistant, an automated assistant, to produce a first draft is not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. So, I can see the potential for, it helping people, like me. I'm not saying I'm going to be relying on it, but it a lot of the writing I've done, just outside of work, just my personal writing on LinkedIn and elsewhere on Medium and Substack has almost always has some sort of personal element to it. And I feel like that has been, something that some people are interested in. I'm not the others not, but I think that has also been, one of the motivations for me to continue to write. And like you said, people like us, we enjoy the process, but we're, not everyone's like us. Not saying we're better than others, but we are. I'm just speak for myself. I realize I actually like the process. It helps me, focus. I get into a state of flow, and I forget my physical pains and my mental, my worries and my anxieties just for a moment. And then when I emerge from that state, I actually realized I was in a state of focus and flow. And I realized that's one of the rewards. Now, obviously, I love it when people hit like and share my article and comment on my articles, but there is just that, pleasure I get personally from the writing process. And I would hope that and assume that this message would resonate with some of the people listening to this sort of, niche podcast and program. But we're sort of we're preaching to the converted, we're sort of a very small group of people. Maybe we're going to get smaller and smaller as a percentage of the population. And, maybe that'll just make us more powerful and interesting. What do you think?
But I come back to this, for me, writing is often how I figure out what I think. So I wrote 2 articles for the Boston Globe ideas section about ChatGPT. Before I went through the process of drafting and revising those articles, I don't think I would have been able to tell you. I had a vague sense that I was not entirely comfortable with this new technology, but it was in trying to articulate it, to get the words on the page for an audience, that I actually figured out what was really bothering me. And one of the things that was really bothering me is something you just touched on, which is I guess the way I framed it in the article is, to what problem is ChatGPT the solution, right? So you were talking about what the people who created this might or might not have been thinking when they were creating it. I think this is a key issue, right? This technology was not created to solve a problem. It is now technology in search of a problem to solve, while simultaneously creating a whole set of new problems. But that framing for me has really helped me think through, when people say, what should we do about this in the classroom? I keep coming back to the idea that, well, one of the things we need to do is think about, to what problem is this the solution? And if it's not, then why are we trying to figure out how to use it in the classroom? We need to figure out where it makes sense,
Right.
and where it absolutely doesn't. So, long way of saying, before I wrote that article, I'm not sure that I could have articulated that point. So there is value, I think, in working through a set of ideas to share with someone, other than just what I'm doing now, which is getting on a podcast and sort of off the top of my head having opinions, which is great. It's in a field that we both think about this all the time, so it's fun to talk about it
Right.
out loud.
Right.
But I think working through your ideas, it doesn't have to be in writing. It could be in long conversations with people.
Right.
However you work through your ideas is how you figure out what you actually think. And so that's not something that's just exclusive to writers. We want
Sure.
everybody. We want our politicians. We want our, presidents of companies that have billions of dollars and are actually making, having huge effects on the economy and on all of us, to be thoughtful people who have figured out how to work through their ideas. We don't want those people to go to ChatGPT and say, write me a justification for continuing to use fossil fuels, right? And then just take whatever comes out of the machine. And I'm not saying anyone would do that, but someone might. But I think we need to think about that, right? Like, what is the value of working through your ideas over time with other voices in the mix who are human voices? And where will we have that? Again, not such a big deal in writing a real estate listing, right? I understand that. That's like what we might call a use case where this could make a lot of sense.
Hmm.
But we need to be, if everybody's using this, then there are going to be use cases where it doesn't make a lot of sense as well. And we
Hmm.
need to be paying attention to that.
Right. Okay. So now that we've concluded that our jobs are going to be completely irrelevant in the next couple of years, what kind of
No, you're saying that to it. We have to say we don't know,
I'm sorry, we
right?
don't know. I'm just kidding. But let's just move on a little bit to a topic that I like to talk about on this podcast. And by the way, it's hard to believe we're in 2023. I launched this podcast in, I can't believe, 2015, almost 8 years
Wow,
ago,
so
April
way
2015.
pre-pandemic. This has lasted through the pandemic and out the other side.
Exactly. But now we've got, we're entering a whole new world, brave new world of chat GPT and generative AI. I just like to pronounce it. It makes me sound smart, even though I don't know what it is. But anyway, let's just talk about some good old fashioned writing tips, which I just, I love to talk about because I think it's useful. So yeah, what would be, your 3 or 4 writing tips that you want to share this time around with our audience?
Well, I think my most popular piece of advice, the thing that seems to resonate with everyone wherever I share it, is to cut. Cut, cut, cut. You are almost always saying more than you need to about any given topic. So I've written about this in the Substack in a couple of different ways. There are these words that we all use that people will almost always say we should not use, words like actually, basically, kind of, particularly, essentially, these words that we put in that feel a little bit like a hedge or a watering down of something. I talk to people when I'm working with writers, especially writers who are trying to get something published. This is a very quick way to both reduce your word count, which often matters if you're trying to get something published, but also to sharpen what you're trying to say. You need to notice if you're hedging like that. If you're saying, well, I basically think you're right. Why are you not just saying, I think you're right? You may have a reason for that. People often talk in person that way because they're trying to soften the blow of something they're saying, so they may want to water it down. But I think it's helpful to think about your intentions with words like that. So that's one way that I think is an easy way to cut. The other way that seems to resonate with people that I recommend to cut is to look for repetition. So it's very easy to look for repetition at the word level. If I'm saying the same thing, I might say, I want a friend who's loyal and true, right? You can just say, could I say loyal or could I say true, and cut one of the repeated words. But I think the more common way that we repeat ourselves is we keep trying to say something more clearly. So we just say the same idea in multiple sentences or even in multiple paragraphs. And if you look back at your writing, you can see that it almost looks like you're working it out on the page, right? So you might say, you could do this with the example that we're talking about now. I might say, I think that repetition really gets in the way of a sharp message. And then I might be worried that I haven't said that clearly enough. So I would say something like, in other words, when you repeat yourself, your message is not as clear as it should have been. those are the same sentence in two slightly different ways. People do this all the time in their writing. So I think if you're looking for a quick and really high impact way to sharpen your prose and get to your point more quickly, looking for that repetition, going through and highlighting sentences that say the same thing or whole paragraphs that seem to be making the same point. That cutting is kind of my big go-to piece of advice. Do you see that in people's writing?
Oh,
That kind of repetition?
no, absolutely. And yeah, it's I've seen that just for years. Even back in college, I remember reading a book by by a professor, and I remember him making the same point repeatedly in the same chapter or throughout the book. It was terrible, but I still see that. And I do that on the first draft, or you know, and then I realize what I've done, and I just start, you know, I just hack it out. I chop it off. That's definitely a big win. I wouldn't say, you know, it's easy, but it's definitely a big win that you can definitely improve your writing by making it leaner, not just for the sake of making it leaner, although you may be
You
under a
may
word
have
count,
to,
you may
right?
have to.
Yeah.
It will just it will sound much better if you don't say the same darn thing twice or three times. Absolutely.
I mean, I think something that goes along with that, or sort of my overarching piece of advice, is that whatever you're doing with your writing, you should be doing for a reason. So I think this really applies when people have been asking me a lot lately, you know, what do you think of Grammarly? What do you think of ChatGPT? What do you think of any other grammar checker that we could name? And you know, those things that they flag things, they're not always edits that I would make. Sometimes they flag very quickly, and ChatGPT I think is similar right now. They'll flag very quickly for concision without understanding actually what the sentence means, right? Because they're a machine. And so you need to be able to look at those pieces of advice that you're getting from the machine or from an instructor or a supervisor at work, or just from your own intuition, that maybe you need to be more concise and say, all right, why am I doing this way? So do I have a reason? Is this what someone might say is an extra word actually in this context something that I want to keep? And so being able to make your own decisions about your writing, I think, is going to be even more important as technology enters the picture. It's not always correct, at least right now. And so using any kind of tool actually demands that you be able to have a reaction to its suggestion. So I think with cutting words, that's something that you want to look for. You know, is the meaning being changed by this concision recommendation? Sometimes it is with the machine-oriented edits. Similarly, I think we talk a lot about active verbs. This is something, you know, oh, you can make your writing crisper, more concise, clearer if you have people doing things in your sentences. And this is, I think, great advice in maybe 80% of situations. But sometimes you're going to make a very informed decision that you don't want to have a person doing something in the sentence, because you want to put emphasis on the action that was done and actually minimize the emphasis on who did it. So we can think about this from the corporate point of view, right? Jobs were cut might be something that you would say if you were responsible for firing 1,000 people, rather than we fired 1,000 people. So you're going to make that decision to be very context specific. You can have a machine, here we are just back to machines again, but you can have, you know, Grammarly will tell you reconsider this passive voice, but you really need to understand why you put that passive voice in to begin with, and if for some reason it's actually serving your larger point. So that would be another sort of go-to piece of advice, is to pay attention to your active verbs and your passive verbs. So one piece of advice I just happened to be noticing lately, and I tweeted about this morning because it was on my mind, are what I call fake transitions. So people often try to make it seem like their ideas are connected to each other by throwing in a lot of moreovers, therefores, in addition, I'm sure you can think of other words like that, but therefore and moreover pop up a lot. And often there is no therefore there, and there is no real moreover there. What we're trying to do is connect ideas that
Right.
don't seem connected. So you'll see this at the beginning of paragraphs, right? People say in addition, because they think that they're supposed to make a transition between the previous idea and this one, when it's not technically an in addition, it's a completely separate idea that is
Right.
not related to the previous paragraph. And I think that can be a really good place, not just to get rid of something that doesn't make sense, but to stop and think, what is the connection that I'm trying to make between these ideas? And can I do it by actually making a connection rather than by putting on this kind of fake transition there? So if it's not an in addition, what is it? Is it another way of looking at the issue? Is it another example? Or is it, I now want to switch gears to something completely different, and I need to find a way to make that not jarring for my reader rather than just pasting on a fake transition. So that's something that's been on my mind lately. I think it's often a sign that an art, if it's an argumentative piece of writing, that the argument is not particularly developed yet, if we just see a lot of those words connecting all the paragraphs.
Right. I know exactly what you're talking about. I totally agree with you. What else? Anything else? One final parting piece of writing advice? Something you're
Parting
seeing,
piece of
something that
writing advice.
you're seeing in the classroom a little bit too much, and it's just sort of, why are you guys doing this? I'm seeing this over and over again. I mean, you get new students, right? Every year, every
Yeah, every
semester,
semester.
and I'm sure some of them are making the same stupid mistakes that you've been seeing for years. Um, you know, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as a teacher, I would say it's not a stupid mistake. It's it's it would be more like something that's not working well for your writing, not serving you well as a writer. I think on the very micro level, and this is the sort of thing that doesn't have a lot of impact in the world, but I notice just too many commas everywhere, right? So, I mean, you could argue this does have impact. It makes sentences very hard to read. So you'll see very long sentences. I see this in the classroom, but I also see it a lot when I work with writers at companies. I think because when you're trying to pack a lot of information into something and you have sort of subject matter expertise, whether it's that you've done a lot of research for a paper or you're trying to get your ideas out there at work, for some reason, this leads to this tendency to just put them all in one very long sentence. And so my best piece of advice there's a lot of ways to cut sentences, but something that I think makes a sentence the hardest to read is a sentence where the main subject and the main verb are very far from each other. And you'll see people, it's almost like you've lost control of the sentence. So you could say, Jane Rosenzweig, who is the director of the Writing Center at Harvard and has recently taken an interest in ChatGPT and also sometimes works with writers at companies and is the author of the Writing Hacks newsletter, went to the store. Right, but Jane Rosenzweig and went to the store are so far from each other in that sentence that as a reader, I have to stop and read it again because I've lost track of what my subject, Jane Rosenzweig, is doing, which is going to the store. This is something, I wouldn't say that I see this all the time, but it's the first thing that I would recommend you look for if you notice yourself writing long sentences. And I do see long sentences all the time. So a fix for a long sentence that we often hear is, well, break it into 2 sentences. But before you do that in some arbitrary way, I think it's really helpful to say, look for your main subjects and your main verbs and try to figure out what is getting in the way of really what it comes down to is like the action of the sentence, the who's doing what. We are able to read and follow complex information if we can keep in mind the people who are doing things in our sentences. And so that's why when I talk about active and passive verbs, we say, who's doing what in this sentence? And if someone's doing something, if Glenn is interviewing me, have him do that. Don't say the interview took place with Glenn and Jane, say Glenn interviewed Jane. So that's one way of keeping track of the subjects and verbs. The other way, though, is to keep them close to each other. I think when I've talked about this in my Substack, I talk about reuniting your subject and verb, right? That's just something that can be a very quick and helpful way to make a long sentence read more clearly.
That's great. No, I love your Substack. It's
Thank you.
and I really enjoyed your op-eds, by the way, in the Boston Globe. You yeah, I just love to follow your writing. Um,
Thank you.
yeah. What's the best way to reach you? I mean, you're at writinghacks.substack.com.
That is the way to get to me, and you can send an email through there if you want to be in touch. And yeah, and if anyone knows what's going to happen with ChatGPT in the future, please email me and tell me, because we all want to know.
That's great. No, thank you so much, Jane, for joining Write with Impact again.
Thank you for
And
having me
and
again.
and good luck with as you grapple with tackle this new technology. This is not the first time we've had to deal with new technologies. I'm not going to turn the clock back, but I know we're not too far apart in terms of age, and we've
Yeah.
been dealing with we've been writing since well before the internet even existed, that kind of thing. I think we can go all the way back to rotary dial. Anyway, I'll stop right there if you know what I'm
My
talking about.
first my first editing job, I used a typewriter. So, I mean, that would make it seem like I was 100 years old, but it's all
Yeah.
changed very quickly. So,
It has. No, thank you so much for your insight, and congratulations also on, and have on being able to share your views on this new technology on CBS of all platforms. That's pretty major. I'm sure you were overwhelmed with letters and fan mail after that, right?
lots of phone calls from friends of my parents.
That's good. That made it all worth it. That's great. Thanks a lot,
Yes.
Shane.
All right. Thanks so much.